Happy Friday, everybody. For the time being, I'm going to be doing these best of 3 sideboard guides until we kind of finish the Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and then I'm probably going to stop, because they have not been the most successful adventure, but I have enjoyed doing them, and I do think that it's a useful practice to understand the meta at a deeper level. So with this, the list that I'm going to cover is the Week 4 winner for the Standard Challenge in Temur Control. And that week, I believe we saw 3 different versions. So this one is running the 2 copies of Fires of Victory, which we saw in the Pro Tour, the Aftermath Analyst, 4 copies there, 1 Shigeki, 3 copies of World Soul's Rage, 4 copies of Nissa Resurgent Animist, 2 copies of Spelunking, 4 copies of Memory Deluge, 4 copies of Ill-Timed Explosion, 3 copies of Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy, and 3 copies of Virtue of Strength. And so we're going to, look at what matches, like, is Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy actually good in, because it's not in every list, right? So we'll explore alternatives as well. And as far as the sideboard options go, we've got 2 copies of Pick Your Poison, we've got 2 copies of Negate, 2 copies of Bonnie Paul Clear Cutter, 1 Tyrannix Rex, 1 Colossal Sky Turtle, 1 3 Steps Ahead, 2 Turn the Earths, and a Braid, and 2 Vampire's Vengeance, which was the classic board sweeper, and 1 copy of Titan of Industry. So with that, let's get into the cards and the tracker data. So welcome to my Temur Control, or Landfall combo, whatever you'd like to call it, best of 3 sideboard guide for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And what I like to do is I like to use a third-party tracking website called Untapped. And this allows me to kind of remove my bias and look at what the data is saying are the best cards for each matchup. And we can go through this. The only downside is that there are some cards in the list that are going to have low data, especially if they're not a common card to have in the main. But what I can do is I can look at alternatives and expand it from the list that we just covered at the beginning. And this is a good way to see what missing options there are that might be good considerations for your own deck. So for against Azorius Control, we can see Doppelgang and Galvanic Iteration are both missing from this list. And then we can also open it up and look at what the data says for the card with all archetypes instead of just specifically in Temur Control. And what we can see here is that Negate is well above 50% and is probably a good card to bring in against Azorius Control. And Tyrannix Rex looks like it is comparable to Kellen. And then notably here, the Turn the Earth is missing in the data. And Turn the Earth is one of those cards that you do typically bring in against Azorius Control if they are planning on milling you out. So keep that in mind if they are running 4 copies of Jace, that it could be a good inclusion. So I believe the data suggests here that we bring in the 1 Colossal Sky Turtle, and we bring in 2 copies of Negate, and we cut the 3 copies of Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. And Colossal Sky Turtle is the channel abilities can't be countered by a typical spell unless they counter activated abilities. And so being able to do your Sky Turtle loop is a good way to get cards back from the graveyard as long as they haven't been exiled. So the No More Lies counterspell in blue and white does exile. So you do have to be careful about playing around that. The negates, though, can be handy for hitting their planeswalkers or for countering their counterspell, because you will actually end up with more land than the Azorius Control deck will. And you could bring in Turn the Earth instead of Negate, but I like to stick to what the data suggests, and so I would be bringing in the Negates. And honestly, countering the Jace instead of dodging 1 turn of milling out with Turn the Earth, I think Negate is actually a better sideboard card. And then Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy was the weakest. The body is really more important, as you'll see, against stopping early pressure, and Azorius Control is not looking to pressure us early. Can repeat this process again for Temur Control, and I forgot to mention, what I like to do is go down the list of the most common matchups in the tournament scene according to MTG Goldfish. And so top of the list this last week was Azorius Control, followed by Temur Control. And if you go and look at my meta review where I cover the best decks in Standard for best of 3, you'll notice there was a lot of sideboarding specifically against Temur Control last week. So against Temur Control here, we can see that the top performing card is Spelunking, really giving us that land advantage over our opponent who is not running it. Fires of Victory can help us remove early like Aftermath Analysts and Nissa Resurgent Animist. And then we get into the low data, and we can see here that Kellen is not particularly good in the mirror match. And as far as alternatives go, we do see Doppelgang making it back here on the list. And then as far as all archetypes go, we can see Tyrannix Rex really pops up to the top, so should be a consideration for being brought in, as well as Negate is being over 50%. And then we do see contradicting data for Spelunking. And this is something that I've mentioned in previous weeks, but if you're new to my whole process, when you open it up to all archetypes, you have to think about what other decks are running Spelunking. And Domain runs Spelunking, and it is not a favored matchup against Temur Control. So the games from Domain are going to lower the Spelunking's win rate, and I think we should go off of the Temur Control specific win rate, where Spelunking was the #1 card. Either way, though, I think I'm okay with the idea of exploring Tyrannix Rex. It is a large threat and can pressure our opponent, especially if they're going to be boarding in negates to stop the World Soul's Rage, just giving us an alternative win condition to World Soul's Rage. And then, try not to talk about the cards. So Negate, on the other hand, we're basically going to try to line this up to hit their Virtue of Strength or their World Soul's Rage after they've hit into a lot of lands. And similar to what we saw with Azorius Control, the Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy is just not particularly good against the control matchups. And then the third most common matchup was Esper midrange, and we can see this is where Kellen really shines. And so it's not uncommon for people who play in the standard challenge to tech their deck particularly heavy against Esper midrange, and I think that's why we see the 3 copies of Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy, because Esper midrange tends to be the most common in the tournament scene, although this week it was number 3. Anyway, Shigeki loops are particularly good against the Esper midrange too, the 1/3 body being able to block the Dinnik and such. And then we do see Vampire's Vengeance making it onto the list, where we could wipe out some of their Fairy Masterminds and their Deep Cavern Bats and some of their annoying little flyers. And then we see Fires of Victory pretty far down low on the list, and we also see Spelunking, although it is well above 50%, and Temur Control is good against Esper midrange. And then as far as alternatives, we do see Doppelgang making it onto the list again. With Doppelgang, the 3 most common matches all missing Doppelgang kind of makes me really want it in the sideboard. But it is worse against the sideboarded negates. So if we open the archetype up to all, we do see that 3 steps ahead pops up onto the list. And so I think this is a reason why it was included in the best of 3 sideboard as a 1 copy, is that you're probably going to want to bring it in against Esper midrange. And nothing else to me particularly stands out in the data here. Negate is above 50%, but it's difficult to say what should be taken out of our deck because everything in the deck was already above 50% as well. So I think what I would do, my interpretation of the data, is to bring in the 2 copies of Vampire's Vengeance to wipe the flyers, and the 3 steps ahead, and cut the Spelunking and the Fires of Victory. And 3 steps ahead is particularly good just as the cancel, especially when you're on the play against Refine. Being able to... Refine is really going to be your #1 target, and they may not be expecting you to be playing counterspells because this deck doesn't usually include them. So I think you can definitely catch somebody off guard with the 3 steps ahead. And they're definitely looking to out-tempo us, so the Spelunking is a turn off, doesn't help develop the board, and it's really about surviving the early pressure, so we can get rid of the Spelunkings. And then the Fires of Victory is removal, but the spot removal against Esper midrange is sort of not that big of a deal, because like if you use this on a Deep Cavern Bat or a Fairy Mastermind, it's not as good as eliminating a bigger threat, right? So unless you're popping a Refine with the Fires of Victory, then it feels kind of mid. And then Golgari midrange has been quite popular and has been kind of coming back since Temur Control absolutely, as we'll cover here in a little bit, absolutely destroys Domain. And Golgari midrange was basically taken out of the meta because of Domain. So since Domain has gone away and Temur Control has come back, or I should say, since Temur Control eliminated Domain, Golgari midrange has come back. And you can see it against the midrange matchup is really where Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy shines, being able to block that early pressure of their... I'm blanking on the name of it. The recurring green dude, right? The guy who comes back as an adventurer. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. But anyway, we can also see here that unlike Esper midrange, Spelunking actually doing quite well. And Vampire's Vengeance also very positive in this matchup, whereas Shigeki and the Fires of Victory looking a little bit less impressive. As far as alternatives go, we do see Galvanic Iteration and Philology Archaeologist make it onto this list. And Philology Archaeologist was in a lot of the original builds of this deck, and then it has been kind of lost over time. And but it does help against the early pressure. And Galvanic Iteration allows us to get a faster clock because we can duplicate our World Soul's Rage for lethal. So it allows you to do a double spell and can be handy against some of the faster decks. So as far as all archetypes go here, we see 3 Steps Ahead, again, being a pretty good one to bring in here, over a 60% win rate. And then 2 copies of Negate as well. And nothing else here stands out to me. So what I think we should be doing is bringing in the 2 copies of Vampire's Vengeance, the 1 copy of 3 Steps Ahead, and the 2 Negates. Cut the 2 Fires of Victory, the 1 Shigeki, and the 2 copies of Aftermath Analyst. And Vampire's Vengeance, being able to deal 2 damage to everything, is particularly good against the card that I can't remember the name of. But then a lot of the other cards start to have 3 toughness, and so I was a little bit surprised to see the Vampire's Vengeance being suggested by the data. 3 Steps Ahead, again, though, is similar to the Esper midrange deck. You may be able to catch them off guard, not anticipating a counterspell. And then Negate works really well at protecting our Aftermath Analysts and Shigekis and such from their point removal, as well as being able to hit something like Virtue of Persistence. And Fires of Victory, I thought would have been a better performing card, and being able to focus, remove some of their early threats for 2 mana, typically is good against the Golgari midrange. So that one I think that one caught me off guard. Shigeki makes a little bit more sense though, because a lot of their midrange threats do have 3 power, and then so Shigeki's not really blocking anything particularly well. And same thing goes for the Aftermath Analyst. And the reasoning why the Aftermath Analyst I think should be boarded out is because you have to wait till turn 6 because of how much interaction Golgari midrange is running. And then the question is whether or not the land recurrence at turn 6 even matters. And I think the data is suggesting it doesn't. As far as the mono red aggro, and this one is particularly useful for those who are trying to tech Temur Control for the best of 1 meta, where you're going to bump into mono red aggro quite a bit more. We do see Kellen does very well against that matchup. Same with Vampire's Vengeance, and World Soul's Rage, not particularly good, and kind of makes sense to me because it is the card that you play last, and it's really just about surviving their pressure. And then we can see Shigeki also does not do well, especially because of them being able to give their creatures trample, so you can't block and then sack and do the land loop. Well, you can, but the damage just goes through. As far as alternatives go, though, we can see that there isn't anything that's really popping out that other decks are running. So no secret tech against mono red aggro. And as far as all archetypes go here, again, nothing over 50%. This is a very difficult matchup for Temur Control. And when we saw 3 copies of Temur Control win in 1 week, I wasn't surprised to see mono red aggro win a top 3 in the following week, because it really is the bane of this deck. But we do see some of the sideboard options are not looking particularly strong, like Bonnie Paul and Tyrannix Rex. So I believe the data suggests that we bring in the 2 copies of the Vampire's Vengeance and cut 1 Shigeki and 1 World Soul's Rage. And the Vampire's Vengeance, being able to deal 2 damage, gets the majority of the mono red deck outside of Godric. And then, as I mentioned, Shigeki is not a particularly good blocker if your opponent is able to give them trample. And then we should be okay with only 2 copies of the World Soul's Rage, since we are likely just going to use that as an early interaction as opposed to a win condition. And then Boros Convoke is another one that's particularly interesting to those playing in best of 1. But we can see here that the Colossal Sky Turtle works pretty well against the Boros Convoke, being able to interact with your opponent and bounce their stuff, as well as the Vampire's Vengeance, which was originally sideboarded in specifically with Boros Convoke in mind. And we can see that our worst performing card is Virtue of Strength, and just not enough time to get everything to work. As far as alternatives go, nothing coming out of nothing on the alternatives list that isn't already being included. And as far as all archetypes go, nothing in the sideboard is worth bringing in that hasn't already been covered. And so what we should do is bring in the 1 copy of the Colossal Sky Turtle and the 2 copies of the Vampire's Vengeance, and cut the 3 copies of Virtue of Strength. The Colossal Sky Turtle is a little bit more important here for the return target creature to its owner's hand aspect than it is actually the Shigeki loop for additional value. And then Vampire's Vengeance is for just wiping the board, and so you don't get run over. And the Virtue of Strength is just too slow for Boros Convoke. And then Domain is one that we've seen decreased in popularity, and this deck absolutely smokes Domain. I think the lowest performing card is 60%. So I mean, honestly, when every card in your deck is over a 60% win rate, there's really nothing that you need to do, right? As far as alternatives go, we do see Doppelgang could be a good one to bring in against this matchup as well, if you do decide to include it. And then as far as all archetypes go, nothing here that really pops out in the data. So for me, Domain is really easy. We just don't sideboard. That should be a winnable match. We don't really need to tech against it. So after going through this process, though, I like to wrap things up with my overall impressions. And one of the downsides to this approach is that there are going to be some cards that just don't show up in the data. And this week, Pick Your Poison, Turn the Earth, and Abrade all had low data. One of the things that was noticeable, though, was that Bonnie Paul and Titan of Industry, specifically, had very unimpressive stats. And I haven't actually seen... Bonnie Paul I've seen more in the sideboard. Titan of Industry, not as often. But they both have not been performing particularly well. If you go and look, most of their matchups, there was data on, and they were below 50%. So the reason why they're brought in here... Excuse me, my throat's bothering me. The reason why they were brought in here is to have a creature-based threat. Like if our opponent goes heavily into the negates and countering the World Soul's Rage, it's nice to have an alternative win condition, especially if they get rid of the World Soul's Rage through something like the Pithing Needle or some similar effect that removes it entirely from our deck. And so I see why it was being explored. But personally, for climbing the ladder, I'd prefer to run Doppelgang and Galvanic Iteration. And partially that's because I haven't experienced that strategy just getting shut down entirely. So that's probably why they brought it in and why I disagree with it. So with that being said, the other thing too that I would consider is bringing in an additional copy of Spelunking or World Soul's Rage or Virtue of Strength or Fires of Victory in the sideboard. Bonnie Paul and Titan of Industry just not my jam. So I'd be looking at some alternative option to explore there. So after this, I'm planning on covering the Golgari midrange and maybe one other, we'll see, before we get into Modern Horizons and I kind of put this to rest. So if you have enjoyed these sideboard guides throughout the week, thank you for watching, or throughout the weeks, thank you for watching. And I'm sorry that it didn't work out better. I feel bad because I have enjoyed doing these, and I do think that there's some useful information there. The viewership for best of 3 in Magic is just smaller, and I'm trying to make this worth my while. And so if you want me to do this sort of thing for you, I would be happy to do that. especially for those who are YouTube members or Twitch subscribers or Patreons. This is something that if you contact me about, I would be happy to do for you. So feel free to reach out to me on Discord, and I will be covering the Golgari midrange next, and I think maybe one more. So we'll see. So take care, everybody. Thanks for listening. I hope it helps improve your sideboard guides or sideboard strategies and helps you get those trophies and win your tournaments. Take care.